works facing the peace construction. In the table is with us Bernadette Atoua-Genet, professor of Chicago with experience of the international laws and development. In the law school, she worked for as a counselor for the World Bank and Human Rights, where she received the award of International Amnesty of Human Rights Patrick Stewart with her job. After the right of school, the teacher in South Africa as a scholarship in Fulbright. She worked in South Africa Constitutional Tribune, working to understand the restitution of land. She teaches courses about the international transactions of business property and international law and development of policies. Buenos días todo el mundo. Mi especialidad es restitución de tierras en Sudáfrica y escribí un libro recientemente llamado Queremos lo que nos pertenece.
Land restitution in South Africa. And in the book, I developed two concepts, right? The first concept is this idea of a dignity taking. A dignity taking says that in certain instances, if I take something from you, right? The point is, at the moment of compensation, I have to give you this thing back or something that's equivalent to this thing. But there are other instances where I take something from you as part of a larger strategy of dehumanization or infantilization. In those instances, just giving you this physical, material thing back is not enough. Because I've robbed you of more than just this property, I've also robbed you of your dignity. And so that's the first concept I discuss in my book, and it's called a dignity takings. The argument in the book is to say when this larger harm called a dignity takings has occurred, mere reparations is not enough, right? Just giving you compensation for the physical thing taken is not enough. What's required is a more robust remedy that I call dignity restoration. And that's the process of giving you compensation for physical things through processes that affirm your humanity and restore agency. And it turns out that South Africa was the perfect place to explore both of these concepts. In terms of a dignity taking, in 1994, when South Africa transitioned from apartheid to democracy, 87% of the land is owned by whites, although they constitute just under 10% of the population. As you can see, only the places in color are the places that blacks were allowed to own land, okay? And the historical record is clear that land was taken in the context of dehumanization and infantilization, right? Blacks in South Africa were believed to be subhuman, savages, childlike. And so it's one of the clearest instances of a dignity taking. And I think the way in which people's land was taken in Colombia as well would qualify as a dignity taking. All right, here in my interviews, I interviewed one gentleman from a place called Kliptown, which is a town just outside of one of the main cities of Johannesburg called Kliptown. And he was what they call in South Africa a colored man. That's someone of mixed race. And during apartheid, people of mixed race, the highest profession they can reach was to be a teacher. So this gentleman had just finished his high school, they call it matric in South Africa. He was on his way to teacher's college, his whole life was set, but then the apartheid government declared Kliptown, his town, an all-white area, meaning everyone who wasn't white had to move outside of Kliptown. And then not only did he have to move out, but then they bulldozed his house right in front of his eyes. And this was a common practice of the South African government because to make sure people didn't move back, they used to bulldoze the houses. And you can see here, he says, because as a child, 18 years old and so forth, to see all of this, it says your dreams, your aspirations, and your hope is destroyed. It was bulldozed. And he perfectly captures what I'm talking about with this idea of a dignity taking. Sometimes it's more than mere bricks and mortar that's destroyed. Sometimes it's your hope, your aspirations, and your dreams that's destroyed as well. This is the idea, the core idea of a dignity taking. South Africa is also a perfect place to explore the second concept I develop in my book, which is called dignity restoration, right? So my specialty is restitution. I study programs not only in South Africa, but I study restitution also in the US, Czech Republic, Australia, Kosovo, Romania, Baltic Republic, El Salvador, Hungary, Germany, Guatemala, Slovakia, Canada, and last but definitely not least, I study the restitution program in Colombia. But what makes South Africa different than all of these restitution programs that have happened all over the world is they actually tried to make the jump from reparations to this larger, more robust project of dignity restoration. Here's a quote from the first Minister of Agriculture and Land Affairs, Tozi Didiza. She says, "The struggle for dignity, equality, and a sense of belonging has been the driving force behind our work as a land claims commission." All right? So what I'm able to do in my book is to assess empirically the ways in which they succeeded, the South African government succeeded and failed at this larger project of dignity restoration. All right, so you guys can follow me. I'm going to give you a quick primer on land reform in South Africa. Land reform in South Africa is in 3 prongs. The first prong is called land redistribution. And that's the process of people getting land, not based on who owned it in the past, but based on their present ability to use the land, right, or their need. The second prong of land reform in South Africa is called land tenure reform. And in South Africa, blacks were not allowed to be owners. And so that's the process of upgrading them from tenants to owners. The third and final prong is what we're concerned with and what my book delves deep into, which is land restitution. And unlike in Colombia, in South Africa, land restitution is a constitutional right. It's actually found in section 25.7 of the South African Constitution, which says, anyone who was dispossessed of any right in land in South Africa, even if you're a tenant, you qualify, a labor tenant, any right in land, as a result of a racially restrictive law or policy, is entitled to what we call equitable redress. And the Land Restitution Act is the law passed to give this constitutional provision life. The agency created to implement this land restitution is called the Land Restitution Commission. Okay? All right, so let me tell you about my methodology, because I'm an empirical scholar, so I don't really work with theory, I work with evidence. So I constructed my study, I did 150 interviews, that's what the study is based on people whose land was stolen during apartheid and colonialism, and who received some form of compensation through the land restitution program. And if you notice, I focus on people who were dispossessed from urban areas. Why do I do that? Because 1/3 of the beneficiaries of the land restitution program in South Africa are in fact urban. But anytime we think about land restitution, we totally and completely forget urban populations who are displaced. So this is a strategic move to fill a gaping hole in the existing literature. The second piece of evidence I use are interviews of commission officials in my 2 research sites, which was Gauteng, which is where Johannesburg is located, and also the Western Cape, which is where Cape Town is located. And this is important because any comprehensive study has to get both sides of the story. I can't just interview the people who were displaced, I have to also get the opinion or the perspective of the government officials as well. So that's exactly what I did, top-down and bottom-up analysis. The next source of evidence is what we qualitative scholars called participant observation, right? So I had an office in the Central Land Claims Committee in Pretoria, where for 9 months I went to work with them, I went to the meetings with them, I was just with them in that institution, mirroring them, following them, observing, doing what we call participant observation. The last piece of data is secondary sources that we all use, laws, dissertations, other professors' articles. So all the findings in my book are the trends that I found over that 150 interviews, backed up, or what we call triangulated, by these other 3 sources of data. All right? So if you haven't noticed, this project took me forever to finish, right? It took actually 7 years because it's really intensive to collect this level of data, okay? So, so when you do a project and you write a book of this magnitude, I'm gonna have lots of findings, but they only told me I have like 30 minutes. So I'm just gonna give you the 3 most important findings for South Africa, from South Africa for Colombia. And let me just make sure, you know, when we think about restitution, the largest restitution program ever done was by Germany. But guess what? Places in the global south, like South Africa and Colombia, don't have the money of Germany. We in South Africa and Colombia are doing restitution on a shoestring budget. And it's in competition with other important priorities like health and education. And so there's the model, so South Africa is a really important model for Colombia. And I think it's a really important model for countries in the global south who are doing restitution. So let me go with the 3 main findings. The first finding is about the importance of process. All right, so let me just tell you how the process works in South Africa so you can follow my presentation. We have 5 phases of restitution in South Africa. The first is called lodgement. Everyone had to file a claim by December 31st, 1998 in order to take advantage of their constitutional right to restitution. That was the first phase. The second phase is called validation. That's where we make sure that the claim really fulfills all of the requirements, meaning you have to be dispossessed of any right in land, it has to be as a result of a racially discriminatory law or policy, and it has to be between 1913 and 1994. The next phase we call verification, and that's the process where we know that this community was dispossessed, but we have to figure out who actually lived in each of the houses. And then if they're dead, and lots of people are dead because we're going from 1913 to 1994, we have to locate their descendants. So verification is a very long and difficult but important part of the land restitution process. The fourth phase we call negotiation. And that's where every single person was supposed to be given a choice. This actually didn't happen, and we'll talk about that later. But they were supposed to be given a choice between getting their land back. If the land wasn't available, they were supposed to be given alternative land, or they were supposed to receive financial compensation. They were supposed to be given a choice. The fifth and final phase of the program is called valuation. That's where if someone chose land, then the government went and negotiated with the current landowners and bought the land from them. You always buy, there's no double dispossession in South Africa. If someone's land gets taken, it's always purchased. And valuation is also a phase in which if there's financial compensation, that's when it's determined. All right, so now you guys are experts in the South African land restitution program, so we can go on with the presentation, all right? I like to start my presentation with what went well. Because when you talk about restitution, all over the world, people are complaining, people are, everything is wrong, the sky is falling, and so the point is I like to start with what went right in South Africa. The first thing that went right is access, tremendous. So the first thing is in South Africa, the point is the number one, all over the world in the restitution programs I've studied, the number one piece of evidence people bring to claim that they were once members of these dismembered communities is a land title. But guess what? In Africa, we don't have land titles. That's a European concept, right? And so what we have to do is, since there's no land titles, they really did a fantastic job of allowing all manner of evidence. Oral testimony, they allow a baptismal record. If you go to a church and can prove you were born in the area, they accepted that. They accepted farm registers, tombstones, if you have a tombstone with your family name. I mean, they allowed probably the widest array of evidence of any other restitution program people were allowed to use to prove they were members of this dismembered community. That was excellent. The next thing that they did is whenever a case kind of was on the fence as to whether it qualified or not, the commission had an institutional policy to do everything in their power to make sure that claim came inside, qualified, and that also promoted tremendous access. The next thing is they provided significant support to claimants. So you have to understand, in South Africa, it was a brutal system, an oppressive system. Black people were subjected to Bantu education. They were made to be poor. And so it would be completely unethical and ridiculous to expect these vulnerable people to be able to navigate the very complicated restitution process on their own. And so what the commission did is they provided significant support, and they did all the research on behalf of claimants to help them prove their claim. So if you did not have the capacity to do the research and prove your claim, the commission stepped in and helped you with that research. Last and final thing that they did to improve access was just last year, the president of South Africa reopened the land claims process. This is an important point because the majority of restitution programs all over the world have a second round because it's almost impossible to do restitution in one round because there's always going to be mistakes and you need a second round to correct those mistakes. The thing that's unique about South Africa is that second round came 20 years later. That's a whole nother story. We won't get into that. All right. All right, so now let's talk about some of the challenges. And this I want you to pay careful attention to because I think a lot of the challenges are very applicable for Colombia. All right, one of the main challenges was accountability. And I'm very careful when I talk about accountability because in the international community, everyone wants to associate accountability and corruption. Accountability, and all they want to do is talk about corruption. And there's this very, I think, unproductive discourse that everything is because of corruption. That's not the problem here. It was a more specific, nuanced issue. What happened in South Africa is restitution was supposed to be completed in 10 years. I don't know what they were smoking, you know, it's just 10 years, I'm not sure. But it was supposed to be, I know, try and translate that. All right. Restitution was supposed to be completed in 10 years. And of course they couldn't finish in 10 years, all right, of course. And so it was supposed to go from 1994 to 2004. So it extended to 2005, 2006, 2007, finally indefinitely. But the problem was every year they were so scared, the commission, they thought they were closing, and so guess what? They were in a complete and total rush. And there are certain things you cannot do when you're rushing. The first thing you can't do when you're rushing is actually give people land, because giving people land takes time. You have to identify the land, talk to the current landowners, you have to purchase the land from the current landowners, you've got to transfer the land, and you've got to make sure that people can use the land productively. It takes time. It's time the commission didn't have. The other thing you can't do when you're rushing is give people choice, right? Because I have to be able to sit with people and say, what do you want? You want your land? You want alternative land? You want financial compensation? That's a conversation we have to have. And that takes time. And I told you my concept of dignity restoration is centered upon this idea of agency. It's all about putting dispossessed individuals and communities in the driver's seat and allowing them to determine how it is that they are restored. And so, but you need time to do that. The third thing you can't do when you're rushing is you can't capacitate communities and build them up and teach them to lead themselves through the process and hold the commission accountable. So it's not a story of corruption. It's a story of the commission being in a complete and total rush and sacrificing quality for quantity is the first problem of accountability. The second problem of accountability had to do when the commission changed, all right? So the commission started as what we call a court-centered system, which is very much like the Colombian system. And in the court-centered system, basically, in December 31st, 1998, when the deadline came, there were just under 80,000 claims filed, okay? And basically, at first, each and every one of those 80,000 claims had to go through this new court that they established called the Land Claims Court. But can I tell you that was a complete and total disaster, right? Because in the first 2 years, they had a grand total of 4 claims of the 80,000 settled in the first 2 years. Because when you put judges in the middle of any restitution program, the process goes slower. And when you're trying to do mass restitution at the number of 80,000 claims, it just wasn't possible to have a court-centered system. And so in 1998, when they figured out it wasn't working, when they figured out things were going tremendously slow, they changed. First, they went to Canada, then they went to Australia, but in New Zealand is where they found what's called the administrative system. And in the administrative system, how it works is it's the commission itself, the administrative entity that processes and deals with all the claims. And if a claimant has a problem, then they go to the land claims court to protest what the commission does. Now look at this. Once they made that change in 1998, look at that. The claims are moving. Now they're getting settled when we switch to the administrative system. Now we as we say in America, we're cooking with gas, right? And so now that's the good story, right? But the bad story about this, we're settling claims, but the point is we sacrifice quality for quantity. What happens there? The commission now serves as the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense. What do I mean by that? I mean, like any government agency, right? The commission's number one priority is to defend the interest of the state, like a prosecutor. And I just told you that the commission held these vulnerable individuals' hand through this very complicated restitution process, acting like the defense. But they also acted like a judge. And here you all should be saying, Bernadette, you just said there was a land claims court. How could they also be acting as a judge? Well, for the tens of thousands of people who couldn't access the courts because they didn't have enough money for a lawyer, traditional access to justice issues, the decision of the commission was final, right? And so you can never have an accountable institution when it's one institution acting as the prosecutor, the defense, and the judge. It was a design flaw that in round 2 of restitution in South Africa, they're trying to fix, all right? So the first lesson I want to leave with you is this problem of accountability. Now let's move to the second one because I don't have too much time. This is another very important finding of the data, is the importance of communication, all right? This is good. So here, one of the findings of the data, 10 minutes, all right. One of the findings of the data is that when we had something that I call a sustained conversation, we had amazing results, okay? What's a sustained conversation? That's when commission officials explained the program thoroughly, they answered questions, they made themselves available, and it was a two-sided dance. On the other side, the claimants were attending meetings, submitting documentation in a timely fashion, actively participating in the process. When you had this sustained conversation, we had consistently great results. What kind of results did we have? Well, we found faster resolution of claims and better outcomes when there was a sustained conversation. Now I would tell you some of the beautiful stories, but now just put a 10-minute mark, so I can't do my storytelling, unfortunately, but this is one of the things that happened. The next thing that happened is when there was a sustained conversation, people had increased agency. It's just like when I was telling you, right? When they were in conversation with the people, they could determine how it is that they were fully restored, right? This idea of dignity restoration only happens in a sustained conversation when the lines of communication are open. Next, and more important, is when there was a sustained conversation, people felt respected. Unfortunately, South Africa didn't pay much attention at all because they were just trying to settle claims. They didn't really pay attention to the quality of communication. And there were many structural issues that led to consistent communication breakdowns. So communication was poor, okay, overall. And what people told me over and over again is that they felt so disrespected by the commission, right? Why? Because the commission had so many claims to settle. And so when people would call, they just could not deal with the workload they had, as well as keeping people informed. And so people were in the dark. People are desperately poor, waiting for this restitution, and they don't know what's going on. They feel frustrated, right? And so over and over again, people told me that this commission is treating me just the same way as the apartheid government treated me. And this was horrible because restitution in South Africa is part of a larger process of reconciliation. It's part of the larger peace process. It's part of the healing process of healing from apartheid and colonialism. And so this restitution program that was meant to heal the wounds of the past, when there was bad communication, it in fact salted those very wounds. They missed the opportunity for the transformative potential of restitution because people didn't feel heard and people did not feel respected. That's an important lesson for Colombia. Okay, the last one I'll talk about is communities were reconnected. When the process worked really well and there was open lines of communication, we had so many beautiful stories of communities coming back together. There's this one community called Sophia Town, and if anyone here loves jazz like I do, Sophia Town is the birthplace of jazz in South Africa. And so they had a meeting. They said everyone from Sophia Town who was dispossessed come to the meeting. And there was this old African grandfather. He told his grandson, that guy looks familiar, go bring him over. He brought him over and it ended up being their Chinese neighbors that they lived next to. And they were jumping and crying and screaming because they hadn't seen each other in 40 years, ever since they were separated by the apartheid government. And you had these stories of reunification happening over and over again when there was when there was a sustained conversation. But when communication was poor, you had the exact opposite. Communities being torn apart by this restitution process, right? One of the stories is a community called Luyolo. That's outside of Cape Town. And what happened there is they were dispossessed. The apartheid government removed these Africans from the center of the city and put them in the periphery of the city in a township called Guguletu. Although this evil act happened, they were able to maintain their bonds because they were neighbors and they were able to stay in touch with one another. But I promise you, when I got there to do the interviews of this community was completely and totally destroyed by the restitution process. What happened? Well, they divided the community into two. One, those who wanted land and those who wanted money. That should be innocuous, right? It sounds reasonable because one takes longer than the other. The problem is that they did not tell the people what they were doing, right? And so this one was excluding that one from the meetings. Gossip got going. You guys know about gossip, right? And they was like, oh, these people are taking our money. And it just went out of control. And the commission never came in to quell the gossip, to tell the truth, to communicate. And this community at the moment is completely and totally separated as a result of this restitution process that was supposed to be bringing communities back together. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go to the third and final finding of the study, which is the importance of restitution awards, all right? So in South Africa, we have a very significant inequality at the core of the restitution program. How it works is past owners, who are mostly black, they get something called an SSO, a standard settlement offer. And it's not related to the market value of the property that they lost because the government can't afford to pay that, right? So they gave them symbolic compensation because they have other priorities going on like health, education, and so they pay the people symbolic compensation. The problem is current owners, when the government goes to buy their land in order to give it to a dispossessed community, they get market-related compensation. So you have a situation where past owners, who are mostly black, are getting symbolic compensation, and current owners, who are mostly white, are getting market-related compensation. It can't be. They must both get market, and they must both get symbolic. And so they're changing this, hopefully, they tell me, in round 2 of restitution in South Africa. But to add insult to injury, I need you to understand how the financial compensation works in South Africa. We get the SSO, for instance, is like 40,000. Divide by 10 to get to dollars. You're on your own with pesos. And so 40,000 is a typical SSO, standard settlement offer. So that amount gets split between, so usually what we call the ODI, the originally dispossessed individuals, are dead. Because restitution in South Africa goes from 1913 to 1994. I can tell you why, if you're interested, why 1913 is the year. But it goes to their descendants. The one who files a claim is called the claimant. If any of those people are dead, it gets divided between their descendants. And if any of those are dead, it gets divided between their descendants. So people can be receiving as little as $100 through the restitution program. The real power happens when people actually get land, all right? But restitution in South Africa, 80% of the people got financial compensation. And it's not because that's what they chose, it's because that's what was pushed down their throats because the commission was in a rush and it was rushing. So most of the people I interviewed never even had a choice between the 3 options I mentioned earlier. All right, now I'm a stickler for time, and I know I have like 2 minutes. I don't like to go over. So let me end here by just talking a bit about, so the study I did in South Africa is the most thorough, what we call qualitative study on land in South Africa to date. But there's a gentleman at the University of Washington, St. Louis, who did the most thorough quantitative study on land in South Africa to date. He interviewed 3,700 people, South Africans, and this is what he found. He found that 85% of respondents agreed with this statement. Most land in South Africa was taken unfairly by white settlers, and they therefore have no right to the land today. 2 out of every 3 blacks agreed with this statement. Land must be returned to blacks in South Africa no matter what the consequences are for the current owners and for the political stability in the country. Right? So the point is, the title of my book is We Want What's Ours, right? Because that's what the people are saying. This land was unjustly taken from them, and they want their land back. And the point is that if that call is not adhered to, if the government doesn't listen and give them the land that they justly deserve, people will move from these legal channels of restitution to extra legal channels to get their justice. And that's what we're facing in South Africa, is restitution is part of the it's part of the larger process of reconciliation. But where we find ourselves right now is restitution in South Africa is not working. And there is consequences when it doesn't work, right? People in South Africa, now there's a political party called the EFF, and their #1 political platform is taking the land with no compensation. They are advocating aggressively land grabs, right? And so my point here is just to say that when we don't get restitution right, there are consequences. And even 20 years in South Africa, after the peace process, after liberation, we haven't got restitution right, and there are consequences. So I say that to the Colombians as, not to discourage you, but as an encouraging note that you have to get it right. Because if you don't get it right, there are consequences. That's it. Thank you.